As Brendan said, we're going to talk about the Middle East. That's the place we're looking at. They're the main countries we're concerned about or interested in that particular area. So we started just looking at overall for a start who's who and so on. As I said, Arab-Israeli wars, which have been going on for quite a while, 1948, 49, 56, 67, 73, 82 and 2006, and it still continues. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the world's most enduring and tragic conflicts, which is, as we're well aware of the problem, as it says there, what does the future hold? The main areas, people involved there are two Muslim groups, the Sunnis and the Shias. The Sunnis are about 75 to 90% of that area, and Shias only 12 to 17%. Then Israel, on the other hand, generally, as we'll see, the surrounding areas is mainly the Muslim. I mean, there's a few others in there amongst them, but generally there's the Muslims, and then in Israel we've got various groups, Christians and Judaism and all that sort of thing. Netanyahu was the Prime Minister at one stage. Israel is a nation state of the Jewish people and them alone. And Israel's new Deputy Foreign Minister, this land is ours, all of it is ours. So these are statements, and that particular person gives speech to Israeli diplomats in which she says we will try to achieve global recognition for the West Bank settlements, which is, once again, they're all saying Israel is ours. It's nothing to do with the Arabs or Palestinians or anybody else, it's ours. So the divide between the Sunnis and the Shias is the largest and oldest in the history of Islam. Members of the two sects has been coexistent for centuries and share many fundamental beliefs and practice, but they differ in doctrine, ritual, law, theology and religious organisation. They seem to be always in competition. Talks about Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Pakistan and so on. There seems to be this division between the two groups. The distribution we can see there on the left is the Sunni Muslims and on the right is the Shias. So particularly around Israel is the Sunni Muslims and Syria, Saudi Arabia, because they fight amongst one another. We've got the problem with Yemen at the moment, Saudi Arabia and so on. Yemen, a lot of people are dying of starvation and so on and so on. It's just a conflict between the Sunnis and the Shias, basically. And Egypt and so on. Then you go over on the Shia, it's more Iran, Iraq, more so in that area. But the sort of general distribution of the Muslim population in that area. The first and central difference emerged of the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 AD, and who was going to be the Caliph or the Deputy of God. The majority sided with Abu Bakr. The other group sided with his son-in-law and cousin. So in effect, one was sort of via the Prophet, and the other lot was via the family. So that's where the division was. You know, the line should continue down through the Prophet, and he's the Deputy of God, and the other lot saying, well, it should follow the family line, so this man's the Deputy of God, sort of thing. So that's where the problem is. They've got this sort of division. So that's why there's a lot of fighting. And you're thinking, why are they fighting each other? Well, that's the main reason. Some of them are more hard-lined than others, and the difference there. But on the other hand, Abraham is a common patriarch of the Abrahamic religions, including Judaism, Christianity and Islam. In Judaism, he's the founding father of the Covenant of Pieces, the special relationship between the Hebrews and God. In Christianity, he is the spiritual progenitor of all believers, Jewish or Gentile. And in Islam, he seems as a link in the chain of prophets that begin with Adam and culminate in Muhammad. So we've got this sort of two people, I suppose, from Abraham right through and say, well, Judaism, Christianity and Islam. They all say, our father is Abraham. We see even in the book of John, Gospel of John, chapter 8, Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, if you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And they answered, we are descendants of Abraham and have never been in bondage to anyone. How is it that you say we will be made free? So they state there, we are the descendants of Abraham. There's sort of a bit of a problem there. Also, this term, the Arabized Arabs, can be used in three different cases. The main one here, defining the Arabs who are traditionally considered to be descendants of Abraham through his sons Ishmael, through his son Adnan, now known as the Adnanite. Abraham took his Egyptian wife Hagar and his son Ishmael to Mecca. Ishmael was raised by his mother Hagar in one noble Arab family who departed from Yemen. So this is sort of where they believe they fitted, where Hagar and Ishmael were, as we'll see in a moment, kicked out, and they moved, they believe, down towards Yemen and settled in Mecca, which is sort of down towards Yemen. And Ishmael learnt Arab language and so on, and that's where they believe that the Prophet Islam Muhammad is descended from the Adnanite Arabs. So that's where they believe he came from. It's all pretty mixed up, but they both believe he is my father. We're talking about Abraham here. He's my father. And if we go back to the book of Genesis in the Bible, it gives us a bit of a clue. And we see after these things the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision, saying, fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. Abraham said to the Lord, what shall thou give me, seeing I go childless, and the steward of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? And verse 4 there, the Lord said unto him, this shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. And Sarah, his wife, took Hagar the handmaiden, and she gave Hagar to Abraham, thinking this is how it works. This is how God's going to do this, through Hagar. I can't because I'm too old and so on. I can't have children anymore, so obviously the Lord's going to have a different way and will help him out and say, my handmaiden has been with me for 10 years. You can now have Abraham's child, and that'll be how the Lord will provide for us. In verse 11, the angel of the Lord said unto her, behold, thou art with child and shall bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael. This is for Hagar. And the Lord, because the Lord has heard thine afflictions, and he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. The Lord is saying this fellow Ishmael is going to be a wild man, but he's going to be sort of fighting with himself and his brothers and the people all around him, because they'll be fighting one another all the time. And Hagar bare him Ishmael. Abraham at that stage was 86, and then when he was 90 years old and 99, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am the Lord Almighty, walk before me and be thou perfect, and I will make my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thee exceedingly. And Abraham fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. So they tried to think, well, this is how it's going to work. And God said in Genesis chapter 17, verse 7, I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee in the generations, for everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee and to thy seed after thee. And I will give unto thee, to thy seed after thee, the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So he's talking about what we would call Israel and Palestine, the land of Canaan. The Lord said, I will give it to you and your seed, and the land where they were a stranger. He came from the Ur of the Chaldees across to Israel. So it was a strange land to Abraham, but the Lord said, I will give to you and your generations after you. And God said to Abraham, thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore, thou and thy seed after thee and their generations. And this is my covenant which is to keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man child shall be circumcised. And he went on to talk about Sarah, and I will bless her and give her a son. She will be a mother of many nations. Kings of people shall be of her. And then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and thought, how shall I be a father, have a child when I'm 100 years old? And Abraham said unto God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee." And God said, "Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him." So Abraham and Sarah thinking Ishmael's the man. The Lord said, "No, Isaac," through Sarah. "And as for Ishmael, I've heard thee, behold, I have blessed him, and I'll make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. By my covenant will I establish Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at the set time in the next year." And he left off talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. So Ishmael would finish up with 12 princes or 12 tribes, and he would be a great nation. And the Lord visited Sarah, she conceived, and Abraham called the name of his son, which was born after him, who Sarah bare him Isaac. Abraham was 100 years old, and as the child grew, Abraham made a great feast, same day that Isaac was weaned, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which he had borne unto Abraham, mocking. Wherefore she said to Abraham, "Cast out this bondwoman from her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac." And the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son, because of Ishmael. And God said unto Abraham, "Let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad, and because of the bondwoman. In all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And also thy son of the bondwoman will make a nation, because he is thy seed." And Abraham rose up early in the morning, took bread and a bottle of water, and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder and the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. So she was moved out of the areas. So we see here this particular area of Havilah, where Ishmael's descendants live in the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula, Shur in the wilderness area between Beersheba and Negev desert and Egypt, whereas Isaiah mentions a descendant of those fellows. The descendants of Ishmael became known as Arabs, which basically mean nomads. From the beginning, the descendants of Ishmael were warlike people, as they lived in hostility towards all the tribes related to them. As the Lord said, they would be a wild man, and they would be brother against brother and fight amongst themselves. That's what they're saying here, that's what they did. This fulfilled God's earlier word that Ishmael would be a wild man and would be against everybody's hand. In Wikipedia, the Ishmaelites were an Arab tribal confederation of Iron Age Semitic-speaking tribes of the ancient Near East, which inhabited a part of the Arab world through the Querites and the Nabateans. So it's just identifying that the people that were from Ishmael are still around the place. And they came down, they moved away, as Abraham said to Hagar and Ishmael, "Off you go, here's a bottle of water and a piece of bread, away you go." And pushed them out, and they moved down, as it says there, down the peninsula, down towards Yemen and Mecca and so on, and moved down in that area. And Ishmael in that area, he learnt the Arab language, and that's where they were dwelling, and they moved out from that. We'll jump a fair bit ahead now, because we've sort of explained where everybody fits. There's the Muslims, which are the Sunnis and the Shias, and also you've got the Jews and the Christians in Israel. So you've got this conflict not only within the Muslims, but they don't like the Israelis either. Neither of them like them, so you've got problems there all the way down there. Since the Roman period, we got the Byzantine period, the first Muslim period, the Crusade period, the Ayyubid period, Mamluk period, and the Ottoman period, and then the British Mandate. So we're sort of starting back in 70 AD. CE is the modern version of AD. That I'd like to talk about AD, which refers to Jesus Christ. We can't have that, so we call it CE. Down through the years, as things have happened in the general area of the Middle East, from the Roman period when they took over, and then the various ones, the Muslims were in charge, and right down In the 1500s, the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, took charge of that situation, and they finished up in that area. It was quite a big area when you think about it. From right through here, that whole area was the Ottoman Empire, and even through here, Jerusalem and Israel. But here's Mecca down here. Abraham moved from over this way. He sort of went up over there, around to here, and he went over here, and generally in that area. So when Hagar and Ishmael were pushed out, they went down this way. And they've obviously spread from there. But the Ottoman Empire, which came about the 1500s, when you look at that, it's quite a big area that they were in charge of, if you like to put it that way. And in 1917, that was through the First World War, towards the end, the Bible prophecy said that Israel would be brought back, and Jerusalem would be given, if you like, given back to its original owners and so on, but through the charge at Beersheba, and then the British could go into Jerusalem without a shot being fired. And the Lord in the scriptures named the day and the month and the year, and that was what happened. So here we are back in 1917, from right back right up into the 20th century. Jerusalem was from 70 AD right through, and a little bit before that, through to 1917. Actually goes back to 604 BC, but Jerusalem from that time was taken over by somebody else. It wasn't as we know it today. It was taken over by Muslims, by Romans, by the Ottomans and so on. But in 1917, I don't want to get too involved in that, but it was taken back from the Ottoman Empire and given back to Israel. And it says there in Isaiah, the land of Judah shall be a terror unto Egypt. Everyone that makes mention thereof shall be afraid in him, because of the counsel of the Lord of hosts, which he has determined against it. Zechariah, behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, when they shall be in siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. And in that day I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth shall be gathered together against it. So the Lord made prophecies about the land of Judah and particularly Jerusalem. Anyone who's being involved with this, particularly Jerusalem, it'll become a cup of trembling and a burdensome stone. Anyone that goes with it will be cut in pieces and so on. So it's not a good place to be involved with, but there's certainly nations involved in it. We know of a couple of years ago that President Trump decided that Jerusalem would be the capital of Israel, which didn't go down that well. So people are trying to gather with it and around it and against it, and there's this quite big conflict in that area. And so in 1948, Israel proclaimed its independence. So after the Balfour Declaration in it was spoken about in the end of the First World War, in the early 20s it was brought to Parliament and talked about and eventually passed and so on. But in 1948, it got to the point where Israel became a recognised state. But 24 hours later, less than 24, the irregular armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon and Iraq invaded the country. So here's this conflict already, straight away. They don't want the Jews in Israel, even though they fight amongst themselves and they want this happening and that, but we don't want those people on our land, because we are Abraham's seed. And the Lord, as we saw there, yes, you are, but Isaac was the son of promise. And these, after the Six-Day War, which is 1967, there was conflict between Israel and particularly Egypt at the time. Jordan got involved. Both of them were defeated within 6 days. And this area here was Israel. And today, we've got all this area. This is where the conflicts are about, this area and this area here, the Golan Heights and the West Bank. And obviously since this area, which is where the Lord said to Abraham when he arrived there, walk around and mark the area that I'll tell you. And he marked Israel. And he said, this will be your land. At that time, in 1967, they went right back to the whole area. They went right out here. But they've pulled back from that in this side and just got that area there. As we read right back in the beginning, from Netanyahu, from the other ministers, Israel is ours. Abraham is our father. And the Muslims are saying, no, it's ours because Abraham is our father. So there's a conflict there straight away. And this is where the nations are at the moment, where they line up. And we see here, this is where the problem is. But all around, right out here, for Egypt and so on, and all these nations are against the little purple place called Israel. But in the meantime, there's fighting down here, there's fighting up through here, Syria and the Kurdish people, Turkey and Syria, Turkey and the Kurdish people, Iran has a go at things, Iraq has a go, etc., etc. There was problems in Egypt, problems right across the north of Africa and so on. There's conflicts all the time in that area, as it says there. We see just of recent days, Israel and Hamas fighting one another. We see some of these pictures. This area here was a 13-storey building. They decided to bomb it and down it went. It's quite a difficult situation now, and sending rockets one against the other all the time. Israel aircraft bombed Gaza just days into the new government after a day of rising tensions. It comes and goes. And they can't seem to find a place or a ground where they can say, oh, okay, let's draw a line here and let's have some peace. They can't seem to do that. And they're fighting one another all the time. We see even here for the right wing and many centralist members of the alliance, including Mr. Bennett, who's actually now the Prime Minister of Israel. The flags march is a matter of national pride, a celebration of their democratic right to walk through areas of Jerusalem captured by Israel during 1967 Arab-Israeli War, which Israel now considers part of its undivided capital. Each year it features thousands of marches waving Israeli flags as they proceed toward the Western Wall, a sacred site for Judaism, but it was aborted in May because of the rocket fire from Gaza. So they believe it's their right to walk around with these flags. And even though we go through an area where they're really not supposed to go, no, this is our land. I'll walk through there and we'll wave the Israeli flag. So that upsets the Arabs, because they get excited when this happens, and because they picked that day, they started to send some rockets in to stop them. So you got this complete conflict all the time. And we've got these, the Islamic State of ISIS is a military organisation that emerged as an offshoot of Al-Qaeda in 2014. It took control of large areas of Iraq and Syria, raising its black flag in victory. Then the creation of the Caliphate and imposing strict Islamic rules. The group is referred to as ISIL, and it talks a little bit about them. The militants' goal is an ultra-conservative caliphate that strictly enforces Sharia or Islamic law. There's an article there. Since December, thousands of people, mostly women, children and the elderly, have been able to flee the ISIS-controlled area, but thousands more remain inside shrinking enclave. Chain, which is named the fellow, hasn't seen many of them while embedded with the SDF, as civilians are not allowed to flee through the front lines. The few I did encounter were all starving. ISIS uses them as human shields and prevents them from leaving. They've been under siege, so they have no food or water. And this is their own people. They're fighting and arguing and going against their own people. But probably in that situation, some are Shia, some are Sunni. So you got that conflict there. So they rose up and tried to take over the area there of Syria and so on, and they've finally been squashed. But in the meantime, we've got millions of people who now live in tents. been pushed out of their homeland, and their homelands were wrecked with bombings and so on. And this is the area that everybody's trying to say, peace, peace. US, Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain signed a peace accord. How often have they done that? That wasn't that long ago. When the power of love is greater, the world will know peace. Someone wrote on the wall. The Lord said in Jeremiah chapter 8, therefore I give their wives and others unto the fields, to them that shall inherit them. For every one from the last even unto the greatest is given to covetousness, from the prophet even unto the priest every one dealeth falsely. For they have healed the hurt of my daughter, of my people, slightly, saying peace, peace, when there is no peace. And Martin Luther King, many men cry peace, peace, but they refuse to do the things that makes for peace. And that really is the problem in the Middle East there. They're saying peace, peace, let's have a peace accord, let's sort this out, let's stop the war for a moment or two, as they are at the moment. But it doesn't last, because they don't want to do the things that make for peace. They still want to march around with their flags and saying, this is our land because we're Abraham's seed. And then the Arabs are saying, well, Abraham was our father as well, so it's our land. We were here first, sort of thing. So it really is quite a conflict. Because, Ishmael was the firstborn of Abraham. But the Lord said, no, Isaac was the child of promise, the son of promise. So there's got this conflict, and it's still going today. It still rears its ugly head all over the place. They're fighting one another in the Arab world, and they're all against Israel, and none of them want to sit down and say, let's make peace. Let's see what we can do here. The Thessalonians, for when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. And what about the future? Where do we go from here? Nature is vital. We can't survive without it, but our world is under threat like never before. Our Planet, groundbreaking documentary series, Our Planet, raises awareness of the world's rarest wildlife and most precious habitats and the threats they face. It brings life to splendour of nature world and risk of losing if we don't act. The place is falling apart because generally mankind won't adhere to the Word of God. And that is really the problem in the Middle East. They won't adhere to the Word of God. And why they fight against one another, the Lord, okay, away you go, you're on your own. And this is the end result. The place is falling apart. And in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 38, it talks about, Son of man, set thy face against Gog and the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against it. And thus saith the Lord, behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. We're talking here, if you look at old maps, we're talking here of Russia and those sort of situations in the northern area above Turkey, Russia and all the little countries across the hills there, the mountains. And the Lord said, I am against thee, and I will turn thee back and put hooks in thy jaw, and I'll bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armour, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, Libya, with them all with shield and helmet, Gomer and all his bands, house of Togarmah of the northern quarters, and all his bands, and many people with me. So all around Israel, really, when you look at that, you've got Iran, Iraq or Persia on one side, Ethiopia on the other side, Libya a bit further across. And then he talks about Gomer and all his band, which is around Turkey and so on, house of Togarmah in that general area as well, and a little bit more towards the east. All them coming against, after many days thou shalt be visited, in the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, or from the Ottoman Empire. It was brought back from the Ottomans and has gathered out of many people, talking about Israel. They came from all over the world, and the Lord saying, which was always waste, but is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. other nations. They shall ascend and come like a storm, and they shall be like a cloud to cover the land, thou and all thy bands, and many people with thee. As it says there in Ezekiel, he's talking about, probably not that far away, a northern confederacy as well as others all around Israel coming against the mountains of Israel to battle. The Lord says, I'm going to bring them down to visit you. And it won't be just put the kettle on, it'll be look out. We see in Revelations, behold, I come as a thief. Blessed is he that watches and keeps his garment, lest he walk naked and they see his shame, and he will gather them together in a place called the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. And Armageddon, according to the book of Revelation, the New Testament of the Christian Bible, Armageddon from ancient Greek, Armageddon, late Latin, Armageddon from the Hebrew, Megiddo is prophesied a location of a gathering of armies for battles during the end time. This lot here was from Wikipedia and also in a couple of other dictionaries. So the Lord is saying in Revelations, he's going to gather these armies together in a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. Armageddon is the Megiddo, and the mountain of Megiddo is the northern Israel. Is not an actual mountain but a tell or a mound of a hill created by many generations of people living and rebuilding on the same spot. So it's just an area of land on which ancient forts were built together to guard the Via Maris and ancient trade route linking Egypt with the northern empires of Syria, Anatolia, Mesopotamia. Megiddo was located in various ancient battles, including one in the 15th century BC and one in 609 BC. We see many conflicts, and when we look at, I'll get my glasses and I think I might be able to read this. Oh yes, rough enough. Since 1999, this is, we have the Shia uprising in Iraq, Iraq War, Qurayshi massacre, 2004, a Shia insurgency in Yemen, 2004 and onwards, Iran conflict, the Fatah-Hamas conflict, Iran-Israel proxy conflict, Naya al-Barat fighting, Lebanon conflict, South Yemen insurgency, Yemen al-Qaeda crackdown, Bahraini uprising, Egyptian crisis, Yemen crisis, Syria civil war, Syrian civil war spills over into Lebanon, Iran, Saudi Arabia proxy conflict, Iraqi civil war, Yemen civil war, Western Iran clashes, Turkish coup, Iraqi Kurdish conflict, Iraqi insurgencies and the Persian Gulf crisis. That's in the last 20 years, just in that area. All those conflicts, and there's thousands of people being killed and injured. That was from 1999 to 2020. All those conflicts, all around that area. It's quite an interesting place. And when we look at it, even today, we read these things, but if we go back in the book of Habakkuk, Habakkuk was around about 620 BC, around that bit before, and he wrote the book there. And at the time, there was two major people, I suppose you call them, or forces. One was to the west, was Egypt. They were sort of at times having a bit of a go at Jerusalem and so on. The other one in the east was Assyria, and the Assyrian army had come down, and probably 100 years before they had taken the 10 tribes of Israel captive and had moved them across out of the way and put in their own people. And so there was this sort of standoffish, if you like, it was two major parties, the east and the west. And while they were doing that, in the meantime, we have another one growing. Babylon came in and flattened Jerusalem and took away people like Daniel and took them captive and destroyed Jerusalem. It was just out of the blue almost. And so we have the same thing today. We've got America on one side and we've got Russia on the other side, but we've also got another people called China in the wings, causing trouble all around the place. And people east and the west have sort of got their eye off the ball. And in the meantime, things can go wrong. And here we are in the Middle East, and there's conflict after conflict after conflict, and everybody's sort of looking at this and that, and all of a sudden, oh, hang on a minute, China's starting to rear its ugly head, if you like to put it that way, and it creates a difficulty as to say, what do we do now? And something like Babylon just come in, took them, and they defeated the Assyrians and so on, a mighty army. But the Lord talked about these northern confederacy coming down and the others joining, because they don't want Israel around the place. They want to get rid of them. That's my country. Abraham was my father. Ishmael was my father. You go away. That's their answer. And that's where the conflict is all the time. And it hasn't been resolved. And the Lord is saying, the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. The earth also with the works that are in it shall be burned up. Seeing them that these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought ye to be in all holy conversation and godliness, looking forward, hastening unto the coming day of God, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. So the Bible talks about the Lord Jesus Christ coming back to the earth and stopping the whole thing, because mankind is out of control, and whatever part you look at, this place is becoming out of control. Not last weekend, but the weekend before, in the Weekend Australian, they are very much aware that China's about to start what they call a grey war, and they'll bring their warships down and just cruise around Australian waters. And what they're saying, they're actually bullying Australia, because Australia stood up and said, who got this COVID thing going? Where did that start? They don't like that. And also Australia is saying, we don't like you there in the South China Seas. So there's conflicts there. There's conflicts in the Middle East. Wherever you look, there's famines. There's been people in all sorts of difficulties around the place. And monetarily wise, we're sort of almost beyond our means. Years ago, if you got a ton of gold, you can borrow so much money. That doesn't happen anymore. We just write another nought or two on the end of the thing. So eventually our monetary system's just going to fall in a heap, because it's a nothing. It's just a few numbers on a computer or a piece of paper. You owe $1 million, or you own $1 million, or put a couple of noughts on or take a couple of noughts off. It's irrelevant. So the economy as we see it, one day it could fall apart. As the nature, as we read there, the earth is falling apart. They're all troubled about this and that, and how things are going to fall, and they're all worried about the global warming and seas rising and all those sorts of things. Whether that's happening or not, who knows? But there's all sorts of difficulties on this earth, and the Lord's going to come back after this conflict in the Middle East and stop it. The day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee, and I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. So the Lord's saying, this is where the problem will be. In the Middle East, there's other things that will get our mind off the ball, if you like. But he said, one day I'm going to gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fought in the day of battle, and his feet shall stand on that day on the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. The Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof, towards the east and towards the west, and there shall be a very great valley, and half the mountain shall remove to the north, and half towards the south. That whole area will be different. But the Lord said, I will gather the nations to battle, and one day I'm going to come back and I'll stop it, and the place will be changed and different. He talks about the fig tree. He talks about when we recognise things start to change. When we read Matthew chapter 24 and see the things that Jesus spoke about, as it says there, these things are starting to happen. We have wars, we have earthquakes, we have famines, we have pestilences. All these things are the beginning of sorrow. These things are happening all around the world. That's the Mount of Olives. Jesus Christ is coming back to that. That is the future. We see the conflict in the Middle East. Mankind can't work it out. We want peace, but let's sign this accord, let's sign that accord. But one wants the land because it's mine, it belonged to Ishmael and my father's Abraham. The others are saying it belongs to Isaac and my father's Abraham. And they've got this conflict. And the only way out of it is the Lord to come back and stop it all. And it says there, in that day that living waters will go out of Jerusalem, half of them towards the former sea and half of them towards the hinder sea. In summer and winter shall it be, and the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day shall be one Lord, and his name one. And the land shall be turned as a plain from Geba to Rimmon south of Jerusalem, and shall be lifted up and inhabited in her place, from Benjamin's gate unto the place of the first gate, unto the corner gate, from the tower of Haneel. Haneel's tower was in the original wall around Jerusalem, unto the king's wine presses, and men shall dwell in it, and there shall be no more utter destruction, but Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. That's the future. That's what we're looking for. Jerusalem and the rest of the world be safely inhabited, because the Lord is back and taking charge of things. The end is near. All the people said.